The house was in perfect order, as if it had been cut out of a fashion magazine about interior design. Sunlight poured through the windows, framing the bright accents of the modern decor. Matthew and Sarah, a young married couple, moved here a few months ago to start a new life. There was enthusiasm in their eyes, the work was going well, their 2-year-old son Jake was laughing every day, and they spent the evenings with friends over wine and conversations. Sarah loved cooking, and Matthew was really passionate about gardening. Every morning, he started by checking the plants in the yard, watching the roses they had planted together, and then came home with a bouquet to put it in a vase on the kitchen table. These rituals seemed unshakable, as did their happiness. But one detail still gave Sarah a strange feeling. Basement. She rarely went there, the space was dark, dusty and served only as a storage for unnecessary things. The stairs leading down creaked with every step, and the light bulb blinked, as if warning that it was better to leave this place alone. Matthew just laughed at her concern. Basements always seem gloomy. But it's just a basement, Sarah. It's okay. It all started with the little things. At first, Sarah noticed that someone was moving things in the basement. The boxes they stacked in the corner ended up in the middle of the room. She didn't think much of it, deciding that maybe Jake was playing nearby, and then Matthew accidentally left the basement door open. "Were you looking for anything downstairs yesterday?" she asked her husband at dinner. "No. And why would I go there? All my tools are in the garage," he waved away, without taking his eyes off the plate. An unpleasant feeling settled in her chest, but she decided not to dwell on it. It's just a coincidence. After a week, Jake started acting strangely. He was looking at the stairs to the basement and saying, "Dad's there." Matthew joked that his son wanted to play hide-and-seek, but Sarah was alarmed. "Jake, did you see someone downstairs?" The kid just shook his head and giggled. One night, Sarah woke up to a crash. It seemed to her that the noise was coming from the basement. She pushed her husband. "Matt, get up. There's someone there." He got up reluctantly, picked up a baseball bat, and headed downstairs. Sarah remained waiting at the door, clutching the phone in her hands, ready to dial the police. But Matthew returned a few minutes later, shrugging his shoulders in disbelief. "Nothing. One of the boxes just fell down." "You're worrying too much." Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a few days, she decided to figure it out on her own. While Jake was sleeping and Matthew was at work, Sarah went down to the basement. She turned on the light and carefully examined the space. There were those boxes in the corner, but now there were strange scratches on them, as if someone had tried to open them. She noticed footprints on one of the walls that looked like dirty fingerprints. Suddenly, her gaze fell on a small metal hatch in the corner. She had never paid any attention to him before. She came closer and pulled the handle. The hatch was locked. That it seemed strange to her. She went upstairs, took a screwdriver, and came back to open it. The hatch led to a narrow passage ending in another door. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard that she thought she could hear it all over the basement. She slowly opened the door and found herself in a small room. There was a table with several chairs, shelves were filled with canned food and bottles of water, and there was an old mattress in the corner. Her breathing quickened. It was like a shelter. Sarah heard a faint sound. A rustle. She whirled around, but saw no one. Not wanting to stay there any longer, she hurried back upstairs, making sure everything was closed. When Matthew returned home, Sarah told him about the discovery. He stared at her for a long moment before answering. "You're just too impressionable. This is probably the old shelter of the previous owners. Don't wind yourself up." But something in his tone made her uneasy. After a week, Matthew began to avoid talking about the basement. He was working late more and more often, and Sarah felt more and more lonely. One evening, when she was putting Jake to bed, she noticed that the basement window was ajar. Sarah knew she was definitely closing it. Fear gripped her. She called the police. When the officers arrived, they thoroughly searched the house and basement, but found nothing. They only advised her to be careful. Sarah closed the front door behind the police and tried to calm down. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was still racing. She looked at Jake, who was already asleep in his crib, and was relieved to see that the baby hadn't realized something was wrong. She knew the police hadn't found anything, but she was haunted by those footprints in the basement. She couldn't explain their origin. Maybe it's just old trash. Dirt came from somewhere, or... She didn't finish, unable to complete the thought even in her mind. The next day, Sarah decided not to go down to the basement anymore. She put the key in the drawer and locked it in case Jake decided to play there. Let Matt handle it, she thought. But now the silence of the house was uncomfortable for her. Sarah began to notice that she sometimes heard footsteps, even though she was sure she was alone at home. A couple of times it seemed to her that someone was looking at her through the window. She even ran outside to check, but everything was empty. Matthew returned home later and later. He waved it off, saying that he had a difficult project at work, and asked not to worry. But Sarah sensed that he was hiding something. One evening, when she was cooking dinner, the lights suddenly went out in the house. Jake screamed from his room, and Sarah rushed to him. She hugged the baby to her, trying to convince him that everything was fine, that it was just a power outage. But she couldn't believe it herself. While she was comforting Jake, she heard a sound. A creak. Light, but tangible. It was the sound of the basement door opening. Sarah froze, her heart stopped for a moment. She slowly turned her head towards the stairs. Darkness enveloped everything, but she knew the door was locked. Sarah dialed Matthew's number. Her hands were shaking so much that the phone almost slipped out of her fingers. Matt. Where are you? She tried not to panic, but her voice betrayed her condition. I'm still at work. Is everything okay? No. The lights are out, and I can hear sounds in the house. Please come soon. Sarah, calm down. Maybe it's just an old house. I'll be there in an hour, okay? An hour? But Matt had already hung up. She hugged Jake tighter, feeling the baby tremble in her arms. She had to be strong for him. Turning on the flashlight on her phone, Sarah slowly went downstairs, heading for the basement door. She had to check if it was closed. But when Sarah reached the stairs, the door was open. She could barely keep herself from screaming. She knew she had left it closed. Unable to wait any longer, she called the police again. This time, she wasn't going to just sit around and hope for the best. When the officers arrived, they searched the basement again. One of them found the door to that hidden room and looked inside. It's really weird here, he said, surveying the space. But there's no sign of anyone here. Sarah began to doubt her own sanity more and more. She spent the whole night sitting in the kitchen, holding Jake in her arms and waiting for Matthew to return. When he returned, he looked worried. Are you sure you're not overexerting yourself? He asked. Sarah couldn't believe her ears. Are you serious? Matt, there's definitely something going on here. Maybe it's just an old house, he repeated, and she realized that she shouldn't expect any help from him. The next few days passed quietly, but Sarah remained alert. She locked all the doors, checked the windows, but the feeling of anxiety did not disappear. One night, she heard the creaking again. This time, she decided to go check it out herself. Leaving Jake asleep in his crib, she picked up a kitchen knife and headed for the basement stairs. The light was on. Someone was clearly downstairs. Sarah felt the adrenaline rush through her. She slowly descended the stairs, holding the knife in front of her. She saw fresh footprints on the floor. Her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the corner of the room. "Don't be afraid." She froze. The man stepped out of the shadows. His face was dirty and his eyes were cold. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, taking a step forward. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Sarah's voice was trembling. "I lived here. Before you. This is my home." She stood there, unable to move, while the man continued to speak. His tone remained calm, but there was a threat in his eyes. "You took my place. But I'm not leaving." Sarah froze, as if a cold had pierced her body. The man in front of her was covered in cuts, his skin looked inflamed, and bloodstains could be seen through the torn, damp cloth he was wrapped in. His face was disfigured, one eye was almost completely covered by a scar, and his mouth was distorted by deep wounds, as if someone had once tried to silence him forever. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "But you left me a choice. This is my home. You took it from me." Sarah slowly raised the knife, keeping her eyes on the stranger. Her voice was trembling, but she tried to speak firmly. "Go away. Immediately." The man grunted, taking another step forward. His movements were slow but deliberate, like someone who was used to being careful. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice becoming menacing. "You live on my rights. You put your things where my place should be. I warned you. I tried." Sarah thought of those strange sounds, footprints, and open doors. It was him. All this time. Her fear turned to anger. "You have no right to be here. I'll call the police," she shouted, taking a step back. The man grinned, and that smile made her shudder. It was twisted, unnatural, and his voice had become quiet and almost soothing. "You've already summoned them. What did they find?" "Nothing. They think you're going crazy. Tell me, Sarah, are you sure they'll believe you next time?" Her breathing quickened. She knew he was right. The police already considered her a hysterical woman. But it was impossible to retreat. She had to protect Jake. Gathering her strength, Sarah shouted, "Get out of here, or I'll call for help." The man seemed oblivious to her threat. He just tilted his head, examining her carefully, as if studying her fear. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said softly. "But you're forcing me." Suddenly, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the basement. Sarah rushed upstairs, slamming the door and locking it. Her hands were shaking so much that the key almost fell out of her fingers. Sarah didn't sleep a wink that night. She was sitting in Jake's room, holding a knife in her hands, and listening to every sound. She understood that this man would not leave just like that. The next day, Sarah tried to persuade Matthew to move out. She begged him, telling him about meeting a stranger, but Matt just sighed in exasperation. "Sarah, I'm tired of your stories. It's just stress. You need to rest. Maybe go to your mom's with Jake for a couple of days, and I'll figure it out." She couldn't believe that he didn't believe her. Annoyance mixed with despair. Over the next few days, the man returned again and again. He knocked on the basement door, sometimes whispering her name. His voice was low and hoarse, bone-chilling. "Sarah. Sarah, come out. I need to talk." She tried to ignore him, plugged her ears, turned on the music. But he didn't stop. One day, she was woken up in the middle of the night by a loud bang. Sarah ran to the stairs, but the basement door was in place, locked. She heard his voice from the other side. "I've been patient, Sarah. But you're not giving me a choice." Sarah felt fear envelop her again. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. "We need to act." Sarah was prepared. She replaced the locks on the doors, installed an alarm system, and even bought a can of pepper spray. She wanted this nightmare to end once and for all. That night, the man knocked on the door again. But instead of calling out to her, he began slowly knocking her out with his shoulder. Sarah sat with Jake, trembling, clutching the knife in one hand and the phone in the other. When the door started to crack, she realized she couldn't wait any longer. She called the police and screamed, "If you come in, I'll kill you. Can you hear me?" The noise stopped. There was silence for a moment. Sarah forced out her breath. But then she heard him laugh. Muffled, hoarse, coming from somewhere deep inside. "You won't do that, Sarah. You are afraid. But I'm not." Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just fear, it was desperation, the clear realization that no amount of security measures would protect her. The man wasn't just crazy, he was part of that shadow, part of that horror that she was trying to push out of her life. He was there. She heard that laugh again. Now he wasn't just deaf. He was filled with anger, almost joyous. With each raucous sigh, she found it harder to breathe. It wasn't just a man. It was something that stuck into her life and wasn't going to go away. "You can't hide from me, Sarah," he said again, and his voice seemed completely normal now, as if he were standing right outside her door. "I'm here where you can't see, and it's only going to get worse. Everything that you have built, I will destroy." Sarah raised the knife and squeezed it in her hands, her fingers squeezing around the handle, as if she wanted to tear it out of reality itself. She felt her blood run cold. His words were like a curse, like a shadow that no simple action could erase. He knew she was afraid. He knew she was alone. When she turned back to the door, she noticed her eyes boring into the footprints he had left on the floor. Blood caked in the places of his steps where his wounds touched the ground. It didn't look like the usual footprints. They were revived. Thick liquid, punctuating every scratch, as if his wounds kept opening, even in moments of silence. Suddenly, the door rattled. She couldn't stand it, the wall on which she had been trying to find support all this time cracked. He was here. The door flew in, and the man stood in the doorway, his body covered in blood, his eyes, though covered with scars, staring at her with such terrible determination that it became difficult for her to breathe. "You don't understand what you've done, Sarah," his voice was still hoarse, but now with a new, even more creepy intonation. "I warned you." Sarah dropped the knife, grabbed Jake and jumped back to the window, but the man did not give her a chance. He stepped forward, his body, despite all the wounds, moving like mechanisms twisted to the limit. He was faster than she realized. Before she could exhale, Sarah felt something cold touch her skin. His hands, black and inflamed, squeezed her shoulders. "You're not leaving, Sarah. Your steps, your attempts, it's all useless." She tried to resist, tried to pull away, but his strength was enormous. He wasn't just a man. He was something much worse. "What have you done to me?" Her words came out in a hoarse, strangled voice. You're not human." The man grinned, and his distorted face was covered in blood, as if his skin was tearing again in real time. He didn't answer. He didn't need any answers. He was too close. For a moment, she felt his fingers penetrate her shoulder, embedding themselves into her flesh. It was painful. It hurt to the point where she almost couldn't understand what was going on. "You don't believe me, Sarah. But you can already see. You see how it ends. All you wanted to do was leave. But I'll be back. I'll always come back." Sarah felt her strength waning. Fear and dread squeezed her inside. But now she had one thought, one goal: she had to survive. She couldn't let this monster take everything. She gathered her strength, remembered Jake, and felt his presence as the last anchor that held her in reality. Horrified but furious, she pushed him away, causing his face to contort into an even angrier mask. The second Sarah pushed him away, she felt something cold and sharp enter her back. She didn't even have time to realize what had happened, as her body was instantly engulfed by overwhelming pain. The man's hand, no longer just a man, slid down her back, leaving deep cuts, and then, with terrible ease, pulled something out of her body that shouldn't have been there. Her gaze fell to the floor. Everything has slowed down. She saw the bloody footprints on the floor, but she couldn't figure out what had happened to her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out of her throat, only a moan full of impotence. The man seemed oblivious to her suffering. He stood like a statue, his face was no longer distorted, but instead was almost calm, as if he had just completed a long and important ritual. But despite his outward composure, his eyes were filled with some kind of dark joy. "You don't understand, Sarah," his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You've become a part of something bigger than you ever imagined." Her eyes began to dim, and her last remaining strength was rapidly draining away. She tried to stand up, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She felt the world around her disappearing, as the sounds began to get lost in the void. But before the darkness engulfed her, she noticed something that really threw her off balance. Jake. The boy, her son, stood in the doorway, his eyes filled with horror. He didn't move. He didn't scream. His face was as white as chalk, his lips were trembling, and he was holding a knife in his hands. The man noticed him, and in the blink of an eye, his face took on an expression that Sarah wouldn't have had time to describe even if she could. He turned to the boy and whispered, "You've made your choice." Jake raised the knife, and at that moment, Sarah realized the most terrible thing. She only had time to notice how the tip of the knife descended into her son's chest before her own life faded away.